Hey everyone, my name is Narbe Alexandrian. I'm President and CEO of Canopy Rivers, one of the largest cannabis venture capital companies in the world at this point in time. And joining me today, really happy to talk to you, is Cy Scott, co-founder and CEO of Headset. Welcome, Scott. Cy.
Hey, thanks, Narbe. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to chat. Would love to hear about what Headset is all about, but also how you see the Canadian market playing out and how you see retailers and how they position themselves for what is to become a larger and larger market, specifically in Canada as more and more stores roll out. So part of this discussion, I just quickly running through the agenda would be to give an overview of the landscape right now and what we call Cannabis 2.0. Review what the top products are in each of the provinces, as well as really dive deep with you to help retailers understand how to succeed with data, because that is such a big core competitive advantage in terms of retailers out there that we should really figure out what the best practices are and apply them to many retailers out there. But before I begin, would love to get a bit of background on yourself and Headset.
Sure thing. Yeah, and looking forward to the conversation. So for those that don't know us, Headset's a data and analytics company for the cannabis industry. We really help organizations by giving them the data, whether it's business or market intelligence, to make more informed decisions about the space, whether that's navigating the competitive landscape, really identifying opportunity as well as risk in the industry. And if they are an operator and have a brand in the space, really measuring their brand's position with respect to other brands currently in the market.
Got it. That's great. Why don't we dive into it? Let's look at the Canadian market right now. What does it look like today?
Yeah, the Canadian market is growing. That's one really exciting thing about all markets in the cannabis industry, is that we see some strong growth, even with this year being such a strange year. With COVID-19 and the current pandemic that we're in. There's a couple of things that I think are really driving some of that growth. Obviously, earlier on in the year, we saw some significant growth coming from some of the stockpiling behavior, as people didn't know if cannabis was going to be classified as an essential service. And since then, cannabis seems to be pretty resilient to whatever economic conditions we find ourselves in. So you've got that. And then specific to Canada, you've got this exciting Cannabis 2.0 product trend. So these are the new products that have come to market that are continuing to take more market share, away from the 1.0 products, which, historically were flowers, pre-rolls, oils, and capsules. And now we're seeing sales going into things like edibles, vapor pens, and other categories that are relatively new to the Canadian market. So strong growth from those things. And finally, retail access. So in markets like Ontario, you're starting to see more and more retailers come online. It was a relatively limited amount of retailers for a long time. So it's great to see more access for the consumer, which is ultimately going to drive more sales for the cannabis industry.
That's fantastic. So I want to take a dive into Cannabis 1.0, Cannabis 2.0, but before we go into there, it's just fascinating to see it from our perspective. Like, we see so many deals and opportunities within the space. And I remember, if we go back to March of 2020, when COVID-19 really hit the markets and hit how we saw the normal being. And everyone anecdotally knew that cannabis, it was recession-proof and was counter-cyclical, similar to what we saw in the alcohol industry. But nobody really knew for sure, because it was the first time a legalized market was going through an economic downturn. And I remember there's so many conversations that we had and so many discussions that we had of, like, is this going to be great for cannabis? Is this going to be terrible for cannabis? And just looking at the data here, you saw a big jump in March of 2020, about a 20% jump. And then the whole discussion was there's pantry stuffing and customers are just buying for the long haul. And then we saw a bit of a drop in April, but then now we're seeing what is like a 40% growth from March 2020 to August 2020, which is, I would never have guessed it would have grown that fast. And I know in July itself, it was a 15.2% jump in terms of retail sales. So really, really impressive to see how robust both the Canadian and the US markets have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, back in March, that stockpiling behavior definitely had an impact. And then the April kind of drop in month over month growth was really attributed to people having enough supply, and some limitations with the outlets. But new consumer behavior, people shopping more online for the click and collect or delivery being available. And people just deciding to choose cannabis during this time is really showing how resilient the market is, and seeing some great growth. I think that can't be said for every vertical that's out there these days. So it's exciting, from our perspective, being so heavily involved in this industry, to see this kind of success that the industry is having in these tough times.
Absolutely. So jumping into the next slide about Cannabis 1.0, really want to understand how the market looked like. And this is some great data of just breaking down the capsules, flower, oils, and pre-rolls of the categories there. Before we really jump into the data and understand this slide and the next one, would love to know, and for the audience to know, how does Headset capture this data?
Yeah, great question. So we work with retail cooperators, retail partners, in a variety of markets. So in Canada, those are primarily private markets. So today we're talking really around British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. We'll have Saskatchewan very soon in our data set, but we also cover some US markets like California, Nevada, Colorado, and so on. So we work with our retail partners, and we actually connect to their point of sale. We give them some great intelligence on their own business status, so they can really understand what's going on with their organizations, as well as benchmarking information. So how they perform to the market. And it really gives us this great lens into what's going on. So we see all this transaction information, we see inventory, we see staffing, we see customers. We're able to use that in aggregate. So we have this data normalization, product classification effort that we do, where we basically clean up all the data, and we take our sample of retailers and project out what's going on in the market. So in a market like Canada, we're able to provide projections for close to 70% of sales that are happening in Canada currently, and more to come. And then in the US, it's about 94% of adult use sales that we do projections. So it's a very good set of data, very rich set of data. And given that we're connected to the point of sale, we see these things happen as they happen. So we're able to provide this real-time read, which really matters. I mean, when we're talking about things like COVID, when you see that sales lift happening in March, in April, if you're making a plan that is going to continue and not see, some declines shortly after March, which would go into production and making sure you have enough inventory, you could end up overbuying or overproducing, or now that we're seeing this strong growth at the tail end of the year, not producing enough. And so really having that kind of real-time read is critical. So that's really how we source our data and how we provide it to our customers.
Got it. So walk me through what the market looked like, Cannabis 1.0, and then take us through what 2.0 really meant for the market itself.
Yeah, so when we talk about Cannabis 1.0, again, that's really talking about capsules, flower, oil, and pre-roll, which was primarily the only categories that were available at the start of the Canada adult use markets. And it's primarily was dominated by flower, which is not an uncommon scenario. That's something that we've seen in pretty much every market, every region that we track, that flower is still the dominant category. When you start to break that down by generation, we're actually seeing in some markets, not in Canada quite yet, but I know this will be coming soon, given that 2.0 is a pretty new set of categories. But we're seeing it at the generation level, like Generation Z is actually buying a smaller percentage of flower, and it's going to things like vapor pens and other categories. But in aggregate, when you take all the consumers and put them together, flower really dominates. So here we can see that, in the beginning, almost 80% of sales were going to flower. And then back at the tail end of 2019, that was down to about 70%, just under 70%, as pre-roll, which takes, the second largest category share at just over 20%, continued to gain steam. And to some extent oil and even a smaller extent capsules. So that was kind of the landscape that we went into at the beginning of 2020, right before the 2.0 products were introduced.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see, because over that period of time, we're also seeing what we call intenders, individuals that weren't necessarily part of the illicit cannabis trade, but now in the legalized market were starting to enter into the market, they were becoming consumers. So I can imagine some of that bump in pre-rolls versus dry flower probably came from brand new consumers who didn't know how to roll a joint or anything like that, or wanted something more of a CPG type, consumer packaged goods type of solution where they would get a packaged product in their hand. So walk me through 2.0. I mean, all these new products came about. How did that really change the landscape?
Sure. So 2.0 became legal at the beginning of the year. So new products began to be introduced. As we see the year progress, in this slide in particular, you can see that the 2.0 products, which would incorporate categories like vapor pens, edibles, topicals, beverages, really starting to take more and more of market share away from the 1.0 products. So in aggregate, you're looking at, flower now, down to about, or not flower, sorry, but cannabis 1.0 products down to about, 75%, just over 75%, which means 25% going to 2.0 products. And of those products, we're seeing a lot of market share being taken up by vapor pens, actually. So about 15% of sales going to vapor pens. So vapor pens seem to be the clear winner currently for cannabis 2.0, which is great to see. Again, kind of speaking to the generational aspect, vapor pens does resonate with a younger audience. In 2019, there was a lot of issues around vapor pens and the vapor gate issue that came up in the illicit market. So it's nice to see that vapor pens is pretty resilient, coming back around and taking this sizable market share. And all of this is happening in less than a year. So, this is pretty recent. And so I'm really excited to see where this goes in 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, I've always mentioned that just the sheer convenience factor and then the fact that it didn't smell, which is a big issue for a lot of new consumers coming to the market, made vapor pen such a hot segment. And even with everything that was going on with Vaporgate, mind you, like as you mentioned, it was the illicit market, it wasn't the legal market. We all had the expectation that vapor pens were going to come back over time. So it's fascinating to see how strong they've come back, specifically around that March period of time where everyone's stuck inside, but they want to buy cannabis products for the COVID working from home situation that exists. So we're really impressed to see how that's showed up. So just shifting over to the next slide here, we see cannabis 2.0 and 1.0, and there's differences in how different what we call mature markets have seen the proliferation of both of those. Can you just walk us through the data set here?
Yeah, so at Headset, it's great to be able to kind of look at other markets, and I know today's conversation is primarily around Canada, but we wanted to take a look at some more developed markets, so markets that have had adult use for a fair amount of time, and there's two in the U.S. The two first markets with adult use cannabis were Colorado and Washington. And, we can look to those markets for some, similar patterns. Now, it's obviously not the same. There's so many differences between, even Colorado and Washington from a legislative perspective. But there are some trends that I think we will see happen in Canada based on what we've seen in the US. So when you think about 1.0 products in the US, now in Colorado and Washington, there were no limitations as there were in Canada. So you could have started a vapor pen company day one in Washington. But the reality was it wasn't a mature enough market. The ecosystem wasn't quite there yet. The number of brands weren't really producing different categories of products. So you didn't see that many. There were a handful of vapor pen companies or a handful of edible companies, but nothing like what you'd see today in a market like Colorado and Washington. So way back in 2014, the cannabis 1.0 products were upwards of 80%, so 80-90%, depending on the market that we're talking about, either Colorado or Washington, which is very similar to what we see in Canada with 1.0 products and the beginning of the transition to 2.0 products, or maybe where we're at today, where 20% of sales or so are going to the 2.0 products. Now, over time, you fast forward to as recently as Q2 of this year, that's shifted quite a bit. You see the 1.0 products now accounting for roughly 60% of the market and 2.0 products about 40%. So taking that kind of insight and extrapolating that out into Canada, I think it's safe to assume that while it might be 25% of sales today are going to 2.0 products, in short order and probably in a faster time scale than what you're seeing on this slide in the US, you're going to see close to 40% and up going to the 2.0 products in Canada.
That makes total sense. I mean, we're seeing intenders become consumers. We're seeing consumers, older generations coming in as well. And those 2.0 products, cannabis is an ingredient. It's not the product at the end of the day. Now walking into products itself, there's number of products out there. And I remember when we were first making an investment into Headset, we were talking about, you and I were talking about the number of SKUs that were entering the market in any given week. And so right now, we see the green rush that's happening, and there's so many brands that are being developed to kind of target that. What are the best-selling edible products by province? And walk us through that. And this is data set that we at Canopy Rivers love. From a venture capital investment perspective, we're always looking at how the rankings are changing at any given time, and then based off of that, we make our own investment decisions. But also, it gives us a good lens into what's happening in the market versus blindly just following what companies are marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most exciting things that we do at Headset, and this goes back to that product classification and normalization. So we've got this database of hundreds of thousands of SKUs or products in a market, across the US and Canada. And so we're able to identify the leaders, and we actually have this information available freely for the top sellers on our website at Headset.io. So I encourage everyone who's curious about this and they want to go beyond the top 3 they see here to really drill into the ranked 4 through 10 for these categories, and also other categories to go take a look. But here today, we're really looking at best-selling edible products by province. And, it's a category that we selected for today. I think it's pretty interesting for a couple reasons. Vapor pens certainly have the larger share of the 2.0 product sales currently. Edibles are no slouch. What's really interesting in the Canada market is that chocolate. You'll notice chocolate as a category of edibles is the real standout. 40 to 50% of edible sales are going to chocolates, and you can see that reflected here on the top 2 products in Alberta and Ontario. So both THC milk chocolate bar 4-packs, both chocolate products, and in Alberta, in fact, all 3 of the top products are chocolate-based products. That's pretty interesting, because in the U.S., to that last slide, when we look at trends in the U.S., it's actually gummies, gummy-based products. So gummies and chews, taffies that are kind of taking that larger percentage share. So it's almost inverse with chocolate. So that could be a trend that we see, and you do see that in British Columbia. You do see that in Ontario with the number 2 and number 3 products going to gummies, going to soft chews. So that could be a trend while chocolate dominates now. Maybe that will eventually flip to gummies going forward. So kind of something to keep our eye on. There's always new brands, always new products coming to market. That's another exciting thing about this space is the history books haven't been written with the clear winner, and everyone's trying a little bit of everything as these cannabis consumers that are in the space now become more sophisticated consumers and starts to attract new consumers to the market. We can expect to see new products, new formats, new categories performing pretty well.
That's great. I mean, at Canopy Rivers, we're extremely data driven, so we use all this data to really gauge our understanding of the industry. And when I see data like that of what's different in the US versus Canada, there's of course cultural differences, climate differences,
Certainly.
et cetera. But I want to, my perspective has always been, if you look at the data and it's different than what you see in a mature market, it's both a trend and it's an opportunity. So the reason why gummies might not be number 1 is because there might not be that same type of gummy experience that in the Canadian product suite that you're seeing in the US, and vice versa. We know beverages are getting bigger in Canada than they are in the US. And we're seeing some major players enter the beverage space in the US. There was one yesterday with Pabst Blue Ribbon entering into the market. So it just goes to show that there's an opportunity in the gummy sector here and in Canada to really push forward and kind of mimic the same type of long-term trends as we've seen in states like Colorado and California in the US.
Absolutely.
So Sai, I mean, we've got all this data and it's really great, but we're at the growth conference now, and I'm gonna put myself in the seat of a potential retailer. How can data help these businesses succeed, these retail businesses succeed in cannabis?
Yeah, great question. So, with headsets, we're really focused on the retail side of the business, and we like to say that we know more about how cannabis retails than anybody else out there. And we can only do that with the help of our retail cooperators. So we do work with a lot of retailers and dispensaries, so we can see some interesting patterns in how data is leveraged. I think a good way to think about from a retailer perspective, if we put our retailer hat on, one common kind of retail marketing mantra is the 4 Ps, and that's really around products, so your product assortment, pricing of those products, promotions, and then place. And so, for today, I think we can really focus on things like products, pricing, promotion, and then with the context of place, probably like your sales staff, or if you're a multi-store chain, how your different locations compare. So when we think about as a retailer and our data strategy, it's really important to start by thinking about your own data strategy. So how do you handle your business data? How do you measure your business data? And this slide here really is a good example of what happens when you don't have enough rigor around data entry. This is category level sales, for a retailer as an example. And you can see, in August and September, some bad data is getting entered from a category level perspective, which makes it hard to really understand sales trends happening with flower, with edible, and these other categories when you start entering bad data. So often it can be somewhat of an afterthought for an organization to make sure that your inventory management team is on the same page. Anybody's doing intakes of inventory is entering that in a consistent manner according to a taxonomy that you've defined, because it really can help you start to pull trends out if you have great data going in. And again, this is really from the perspective of your own business data, less of market data. There's plenty of third-party market data sources that you should certainly evaluate, and there's certain criteria to do that as well. But when we talk about just your internal business data, just make sure as a retailer that you have a good system of data entry there.
Great. So when we look at retailers and data is a big piece, and I totally agree that they need to invest more and more in this modern world, 2020 and onwards, of capturing that data and cleansing that data and keeping it in a fashion where they can understand it, and then using headset to understand what other retailers are doing and then how that they differ from those. What are some of the things that retailers need to do to really understand their consumer and make more informed marketing decisions?
Yeah, your customer is critical, right? Always attracting the right audience, and so to do that, often you'll leverage a variety of channels from a marketing perspective. So one of the things that retailers can do that's pretty powerful is actually start measuring those marketing channels and measure the ROI on those channels and really understand how they drive the business. So in this example that we're looking at, you can see different referral sources for a retailer. And again, this is just an example. But in this example, you can see Facebook, is driving 5% of revenue for customers ages 25 and younger. So not that many of a younger audience is coming from Facebook. So it's an older audience. And that might be okay. Maybe your retailer is targeting an older audience of consumers, and maybe you do that because their average basket size is larger than a generation, Z or Z and a millennial. And so it can be really critical to look at that and know where you want to put your money into and measure the ROI on that. So again, measuring the data coming from your marketing channels and really understanding where to put those resources can be quite helpful from a customer acquisition perspective.
How can we better use data to manage internal operations and the retailers within the store?
Yeah, I think a couple ways certainly stand out. Staffing is a big one. So again, to the 4 Ps, place and your location of your retail, and every place has to be staffed to be able to support the customers coming in, and understanding when to best staff it is critical. In this heat map, we can see that afternoons on Saturday from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. are really the busiest, which isn't that big of a surprise. People going out weekends purchasing cannabis, but knowing how your sales are impacted by different days of the week and even different times of the day can really help with understanding how much you need to be staffing at those times to make sure that you're not having too many people standing around, and you have enough people to meet the customer demand as they come into your locations, and then that just turns into more tickets, more transactions, more volume, and ultimately more revenue. So staffing, understanding sales trends, time of day, day of week are really what can help guide you there. And then measuring their performance as staff members and how they benchmark versus in just your locations in general. And then in addition to staffing, inventory is absolutely critical. Managing your inventory, and this every dollar counts as a retailer, and so you don't want to have a lot of money tied up in inventory that's kind of sitting around and not moving. There's this concept of inventory turn that retailers are all familiar with, and how often does your inventory turn over? And so you want that optimal amount, and you want that because you can free up that cash flow to spend on those marketing resources and those different channels, and to invest more in things like Facebook or what have you to drive customers. If your dollars are tied up in inventory in the back room and that inventory is not moving, then that's really not great. And on the flip side of that, if you never have enough inventory, if your turn is too high and maybe you're understocked, then it's could cause stockouts, which are terrible for the customer. They come in expecting a specific product and it's not there. And we've all had that experience. It's really frustrating. You drive to a location and you can't get what you came for. But also as a inventory manager at the retailer, it's just more effort for you to be making sure that you're constantly replenishing that inventory. So finding that sweet spot. And in this graph, we really can show like a range of what is properly stocked, and what is overstocked and understocked. And the stock coverage ratio is a good metric as a retailer to be thinking about. If you have a stock coverage ratio of 10, or in this example, 14.4 for non-cannabis products at your store, so that would be things like t-shirts, what have you. That means that you have 14 times as many products as you really need for the time frame that you're measuring. So being mindful of that, really looking for that 1.0 cannabis stock coverage ratio is the sweet spot on your inventory turn. So I'd say, staffing, being mindful of that, and then your inventory carry and just how often you're turning over that inventory and having that Goldilocks amount of never too much, never too little, just the right perfect amount.
Got it. So, I mean, it's the year 2020 and anybody's opening up a store, cannabis dispensary, you can't just blindly open up stores and hire people and expect that inventory is going to fly off the shelf. There's more of a data-driven approach that really defines the standard stores and the mediocre stores and the ones that are really selling well. Now, when we look at Ontario or Canada even specifically, in Ontario, we know there's a huge ramp up of brick and mortar stores because there's a big backlog from a licensing perspective. And for every new store that opens up, there's potentially about $1 million of inventory that they need to buy to get going. If you think about compared to alcohol stores, there's about 1,000 stores needed in Ontario. So that's about $1 billion of market that we're going to see really play out in the next few years, hopefully much sooner, because we see that as being a big catalyst for Canada. How can we take data and approach it and develop the right strategy when we're opening a brand new store? Yeah,
that's all great points. I think just a handful of years ago, it was okay to, open a store and kind of just take a guess because there wasn't, as much competition. But today's world is very different and the stakes are much higher. And to your point, with a market like Ontario, where you're seeing so many licenses getting issued so rapidly, you're going to see this influx of retailers coming to market and just means more competition. And so, to having a data forward approach is absolutely critical because again, the stakes couldn't be higher. Also, many retailers are taking on investments, and those investments have expectations around, projections and what you're going to be able to accomplish. And so the only way to really do that well is to understand kind of the market dynamics and what's going on in the Ontario market, for example, from a sales perspective, from an inventory carry perspective, to really be able to develop, pro formas based on, your location of your business, and really if you invest that $1 million in inventory, what does inventory turn look like for an average retailer? What categories of inventory are you going to be carrying? Does it match kind of what's currently selling? What segments of a category, like are you carrying more gummies or more chocolates, to kind of that point that we brought up earlier? Really looking at that, taking a hard look at how that fits with the general market behavior can really give you better projections on how you're going to perform as a business and where you need to invest in your business. So there's plenty of tools. Had some great tools for that. This is definitely a big component of our business as we work with our retail cooperators to help them. We love starting to work with retailers right when they get started from day one, because there's just so much retailers have to think about, from the marketing, driving customers in, making sure you have all that right inventory, making sure that you have the right projections. So looking at market data is a great way to kind of answer some of those questions.
Awesome. Well, we're coming up close to the end of our time together, and we've learned a lot about what's happening in the market and how to really position yourself as a retailer for what's to come. Any last words that you want to give the audience in terms of what to think of next and how to plan for the adventure and the roller coaster that is the cannabis industry?
Yeah, just stay on top of it. It changes quickly. If you asked these same questions a year ago, I'd have a different answer. I wouldn't even be able to talk about 2.0 products. We wouldn't be talking about the influx of retailers coming into Ontario. So just when you think you know everything about the industry, it changes on you. And that we see that time and time again across different provinces, across different states in the US. So, stay on top of it, pay attention to what's going on in the market and use that information in your strategy to really have a successful retail business, or if you're a product manufacturer, develop that next leading brand.
Awesome. Well, Sai, thank you so much for joining us. And to anybody else that wants to see some of the free data that's out at Headset, visit www.headset.io. Always a pleasure talking to you, this time on camera versus on the phone normally. Hope you have a pleasant day and look forward to having more chats in the future.
Thanks for having me, Narbe.
Thank you.